He was walking last night outside the house, my cousin Melina told us. When we arrived at that Christmas celebration, I remember well that my grandmother said that contrary to what is believed during events and religious holidays, evil is much more present. Satan and his demons seek at all costs to make the faith of men falter and thus end up dragging their souls to hell. It was 1997, that Christmas Eve. I had dinner with my entire family at my grandmother's house, which was in the same colony as my house, only that at opposite ends in the same area lived Carlos and Flavio, my lifelong friends since we had met in kindergarten, and those who, as their family celebrations were very quiet and even boring, I invited them to stop by my grandmother's house after dinner with my family. We really put together a party as it should be, so my friends would surely have a very good time with us. We were not wrong. Both arrived around 11 and we ended up having fun dancing and drinking with my family until almost 5 in the morning. At that time, Flavio said goodbye. It was time to go home. Carlos would also leave, and without thinking much, I decided to go with them. My parents still had energy enjoying drinks with my uncles, but I was already very tired. My friends and I had to walk about 10 blocks to get to the other side of the colony. There, we would leave Carlos and Flavio first, and I would walk basically a few more meters to get to the sidewalk where our houses were. We said goodbye to everyone and began the way back. We were joking, already quite dizzy from the alcohol we had consumed, talking about what we would do the following days that we had a break from the university. We then crossed a sidewalk where the parish of the colony was, that temple. We saw something unusual. The priest was outside on the stairs. Father Sergio was sitting on the last step with his hands covering his head, as if he had fallen asleep. Of course, that seemed very strange to us. Perhaps some family had invited him to celebrate Christmas, and he had also returned with a few drinks too many. It was a little inappropriate that he had gone to celebrate wearing his cassock. We then approached to shake him to wake him up and tell him to go into the parish house or at least to the church. It was starting to get very cold, and nobody wanted the father to get sick. Flavio shook him by the shoulders. Father Sergio raised his head unsteadily, as if he were extremely drunk. He opened his eyes very wide in surprise, but also in a rather disturbing way. We told him that he needed to go into the house or to the church, and the father only pointed to the door of the temple without saying a word. Carlos went to check. The church was open. So, without knowing very well what to do when not finding any keys in his clothes, Flavio and I lifted the priest and held him by the shoulders to carry him inside the temple, where we laid him down on a bench, hoping that at least that would protect him from the cold. He stayed lying down. We left there, closing the door, and began to go down the stairs of the church, a little moved because the priest was left alone there, but also joking about the same situation, drunk young people being drunk. Later, I don't remember well how, but Flavio mentioned again that the priest would be left alone, and then a voice called us. Young people, we heard someone calling us. It was a horrible voice that made the three of us turn around. We had left him lying down, totally out. Now he was standing there, completely upright. His gesture looked strange. He seemed to smile, but that grimace he had on his face was too exaggerated, as if his mouth could stretch to the sides. The voice with which he had called us had already disturbed us, but together with that image, it caused the blood to run cold in the three of us. It's just like that, he said again with that terrifying voice that sounded like many voices at once. We began to walk with our legs trembling. Then Father Sergio came down the stairs, but he didn't do it. He didn't do it taking steps. I don't swear that priest floated over the steps until he reached the floor. That was the last thing we saw because at that moment, the three of us began to run. We ran as we probably hadn't done in years. We ran feeling that thing was coming on our heels. We arrived at Carlos's house, and the three of us went in there. His family was already asleep. Of course, but we didn't care to repeat, almost shouting and with rudeness, that we couldn't believe what we had experienced just a few seconds before. Needless to say, neither Flavio nor I went home until the sun had fully risen. Around 9 in the morning, my parents, having gone on a bender as they had not done for years, returned to my house late in the afternoon. My mother practically went to sleep, but before going to bed, I took the opportunity to ask them about Father Sergio, because he was an extremely friendly person with the entire community. Everyone loved him. "No, son," The father is not going to return until Saturday after Mass. Don Ramon took him to Toluca to spend Christmas with a cousin of his. My mother answered. I did not give her anything at that moment about what had happened, and frankly, it would be a few weeks before I did. As incredible as it may seem, my mother did not tell me it was my imagination, nor did she validate my story. On the contrary, she reminded me that on that Christmas day, that night when we arrived at my grandmother's house, my cousin Melina, when greeting us, told us almost excitedly that he had been walking outside her house the night before. I did not hear anything else, but apparently my cousin repeated that many times during the night. And when my mother asked my aunt what the girl was talking about, she told her that the night before they had gone out into the street after having clearly heard as if a huge sheet of metal was hit in their garden. They did not find anything that had caused that sound. Neither they nor their neighbors, who also went out alerted by that noise. While the adults talked, wondering what that had been, they heard the children begin to say that he was walking through those streets that night. Then everyone, including my mother when she heard that story, thought that it was simply an episode of the children's overflowing imagination and perhaps the influence of some horror movie. I do not blame them. I would have thought the same, but after what we saw, maybe those children were not so wrong. Perhaps that Christmas, he did walk through my neighborhood on those cold winter nights. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. We went through very difficult years when my mother separated from me and my dad. My mom had to take on all kinds of jobs, sometimes even more than one at a time, to support my brother and me, who were barely 6 and 8 years old, respectively. What I'm going to tell you is not my story, but a story that my mother experienced that winter. She avoids everything that has to do with the paranormal. And who would have thought that she was the protagonist of one of these stories? On December 24th, my mom was in an extreme hurry. She had recently started working at a company located on the highway on the outskirts of the city where we lived. That day, everything had gone wrong. Human and administrative errors extended my mother's workday to the point where she ended up practically alone in the company, accompanied only by the accountant and the security guard, since everyone had left early on that date. Surely you don't need me to take you anywhere? Rosa, the accountant, asked my mother when they finally left around 10 at night. My mother firmly said no. She had not been working there for long and did not feel the confidence necessary to leave in that man's car. How a single lady was going to get into the car of a married man? As illogical as it may seem, my mother preferred to walk to the house. She calculated that at a brisk pace it would take an hour, and it was just the right time to get to dinner with us before midnight. She did not think about it much and began her walk. That road, busy during the day, had become an extremely lonely and silent road at night. The waning moon illuminated very little, and not much could be seen beyond the road and the oaks and bushes that bordered it. Half an hour had barely passed when my mother began to hear a noise that began to make her nervous. It was the sound of vegetation and branches breaking, the sound just like the one someone or something would make walking next to her, but through the field after the tree line. My mother was already walking at a hurried pace, but speeding up at that moment was the only viable option for her in that dark and lonely place. Then she took off her shoes and began to walk like that without shoes on the road, so she could advance at a higher speed without caring about tearing the socks she was wearing. When she reached a curve where the trees rose much higher, the greatest terror of my mother began to become reality. Those noises that seemed only the sound of rustling vegetation and that could, in any case, be from an animal or from my mother's own imagination began to be accompanied by voices. Voices that were clearly those of two men who were approaching with terrible intentions for her. My mother began to sweat cold and practically began to cry. Despite the fact that she had no vision of her pursuers, she knew that she still had a long way to go. What was she going to do? Wait there for them to attack her? My mother then began to run along that winding curve while the voices of those who knew they had been discovered shouted insults at her. She ran until she got out of that curve, a little relieved that those voices had been left behind, but she knew that her physical condition was terrible and she couldn't keep running. The rest of the way, she heard them yelling at her. She heard those annoying men coming after her again. She began to analyze her options. She thought that maybe it would be better for her to cooperate and not put up resistance in order to survive. Suddenly, something shone from behind her. A warm light illuminated her from behind. She realized that they were two headlights of a car that seemed to have come out of nowhere and that turned on with all the power they had. My mother turned her head to yell for help, of course, also unsure of whether the person who was driving was someone honest or an accomplice of those criminals. It was a taxi, the car that pulled over next to her. An older man with a very warm expression was driving the vehicle. He told her to get in with a smile that inspired a lot of confidence and tenderness in my mother. "Oh, hey, but who would think of walking alone around here?" Danita, the taxi driver, said, in what seemed more like warm advice than a reproach. My mother turned around, and through the back window, she could see, illuminated by the car's lights, two men coming out of the bushes. They looked homeless, but they had a grotesque and unpleasant appearance, the kind of people who have evil drawn on their faces. "It was a mistake. It was a mistake," my mother answered the driver. And then, in front of my mother's tears, the man asked her where she lived. After telling her that she lived in the neighborhood next to him, the good man offered to take her to my cousin's house, which was where we were staying. It was 11:10 at night when my mother opened the door of the house. She was totally upset and clearly affected by what had happened, but her cousins consoled her, and that evening ended happily, everyone celebrating. A very significant Christmas with the family. The next day, my mother did not want to leave things like that. Between the conversation on the way home, the man had told her what street he lived on. So with one of her cousins, my mother went to look for that man with some dishes full of food that she had prepared at home. The man's taxi had a license plate that ended in 12, and the street where he supposedly lived was not very long. It would not be difficult to find him or for someone to know him by his description. In fact, when they arrived, it did not take them long to find the taxi, but to the surprise of my mother and my aunt, the car that my mother had traveled in the night before had become a piece of junk. It was practically a shell of a car that was not functional at all. The rusty license plate could still be distinguished perfectly. My mother felt confused, but without knowing much about cars, she simply thought that maybe that man already had a new car. She knocked on the door, and a young woman opened it, perhaps the same age as my mother. "Good afternoon. Is Don Augusto here? I came to drop off some things," said my mother. But she only found a strange face from that girl who asked her to wait a little. A few minutes later, a lady from about 60 years old emerged from that house, confused and perhaps somewhat upset. She asked my mother who she was looking for and why. My mother had no qualms about answering her questions, but when she finished answering her questions, she noticed that the woman had let a couple of tears escape on her cheek. "Oh, lady, I can't give my husband what you brought. Augusto died 11 years ago," she answered them, and before my mother's strange look, the lady invited her to come into her house. Inside, there were many children running, and judging by my mother, there were members of 3 families gathered that afternoon. "Look, there's my old man," the woman told her, pointing to an altar they had on a bookcase where the photo of that gentleman, that driver from the night before, was the centerpiece. My mother didn't know what to do. For a moment, she felt that the strength in her legs was leaving her, and a wave of heat immediately ran through her body. She thought she was going to faint. "We have 3 daughters, one of them my Yola, almost. She was attacked on a road too." "Oh, I guess that's why Augusto helped you," the woman told her. While all her relatives gathered there looked at her strangely, my mother took her by the arm and told her that maybe she was right. She took out the food toppers and told them that it wasn't much but that she wanted to leave them that as a thank you. They accepted the food, and my mother and my aunt then left there with more questions than answers. Questions that lasted for many years in my mother's head. Questions that she could never resolve but that she eventually ended up forgetting, thanking her for having met that Christmas angel that dark night. Blessings to all. My name is Mario, and this is the story of Screams in the Night. Our euphoric son woke us up that December morning, showing us his toy, something Santa Claus had left him. My husband and I were confused. We asked him where he had found it. Our son said it was under the Christmas tree, wrapped, and with a note for him. That year had been extremely difficult for our family. My husband and I had lost our jobs. The enormous hospital debts due to the long illness that my mother had suffered before she died had finished us off economically. In addition to the debts in the bank, there was a fracture that my husband suffered and other small setbacks. That year, we had to leave our house that we were paying for and move to a humble neighborhood in the center of the city of Chicago. Of course, Christmas gifts were not a priority. Fortunately, we did not have the tradition instilled in our family that Santa Claus left gifts, but we did want to give something to our son. Some clothes were what we had bought for him. So when that morning he showed us the toy car that he had received, we could not help but be surprised and worried. My husband quickly got up and checked everything. The doors and windows were completely closed, and there were no signs that anyone had entered. But there was no way that toy had arrived there. Santa Claus? Maybe. It is the most harmless explanation, but the reality is that during the months we were living in that neighborhood, my husband and I remained terrified that someone else there had the keys to our house, that someone else could enter during the nights while we slept, that someone was stalking us in our dreams.